Let's take your Bibles if you have them. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God stands forever. Thank you. And good morning, family. Good morning. Did you enjoy that extra hour of sleep? Oh, that was nice. That was really nice. And one other question, are you guys ready for the political ads to stop? Yes. I am worn out, I tell you. Well, this morning, I want to bring a message entitled Thriving Through Adversity. Anybody ever have any trouble in their life? Anybody? Yeah, every one of us. This is a universal deal. If you live long enough in this life, you're going to have trouble. And sometimes that trouble, it's to the point where you don't think you're going to make it, right? I mean, you're going to be financially ruined. Maybe even your life is at stake. Your marriage is at stake. Maybe you're on the brink of losing your children. I mean, there's some really tough challenges and storms that come into our life. And if you get into the Word, you'll see there's all kinds of wonderful stories in the Bible, and oftentimes there's storms, there's trouble. And you see these Old Testament believers and New Testament believers working through these issues with God's help, and in the end, becoming conquerors. And so I think there's something I wanted to dig into today about this. And one of my favorite books in the Bible is the book of Esther. I love that. I love that story. It's one of the best stories ever written. And it's been a long time since I've heard a message on Esther, and so I thought, you know what? They were foolish enough to ask me to preach again, so I'm going to speak on one of my favorite books, and that's the book of Esther. So there are 10 chapters in the book of Esther, and to avoid reading 10 chapters this morning to tell you the story, I'm going to attempt to summarize the story. And then we'll dig down deep in, and we'll see what principles are there for us as we read this story. So the book of Esther is one of the more exciting and curious books in the Bible. The story is set over 100 years after the Babylonian exile of the Israelites from their land. And while some Jews returned to Jerusalem, remember Ezra and Nehemiah, many did not. And so the book of Esther is about the Jewish community living in Susa, the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire. The characters in the story are two Jews, Mordecai and his niece Esther, and then there's the king of Persia, Xerxes I, who's something of a drunken pushover in the story. And then there's the Persian official Haman, who is the cunning villain, right? The book opens with the king of Persia throwing two elaborate banquet feasts that last a total of 187 days. And it's for all the grandiose purpose of displaying his greatness and splendor. And on the last day of the banquet feast, he's really drunk, and he demands that his wife, Queen Vashti, appear at the party to show off her beauty. Well, she refuses. And so in a drunken rage, the king deposes and divorces Vashti and makes the silly decree that all Persian men should now be the masters of their homes. Well, then he holds a beauty pageant because he wants to find another new queen. This kind of sounds like a really bad reality show to me, but it's right here that we're introduced to Esther and Mordecai. Now, Esther hides her Jewish identity and enters the beauty pageant and wins. The king is so obsessed with Esther that he elevates her to become the new queen of Persia. Now, after this, and even more unexpected, is the fact that Mordecai just happens to overhear two royal guards plotting to murder the king. And so he informs Esther, who in return informs the king, and Mordecai gets credit for saving the king's life. What I find curious about the book of Esther is that God is not mentioned anywhere. But it's clear all of this seems providentially ordered. And you're asking, well, what is God up to? Well, let's keep going. So we're next introduced to Haman. who is not actually a Persian. He's called an Agagite, who was a descendant of the ancient Canaanites. Remember them? The king elevates him into the highest position in the kingdom, and he demands that everybody kneel before Haman. But when Mordecai sees Haman, he refuses to kneel. Now you might be asking yourself, what's the big deal, Mordecai? Just kneel. But this obviously went beyond offering honor and respect to a leader. The king and Haman were demanding worship, which is something that a Jew could not do in good conscience. It's simply against God's law. So Mordecai's refusal to kneel, of course, fills Haman with rage. And when he finds out that Mordecai is Jewish, Haman successfully persuades the king to enact a crazy decree to destroy all the Jewish people. To decide the date of the Jews' annihilation, Haman rolls the dice, called a pur in Hebrew. Tuck that away for later. 11 months later, on the 13th of Adar, all the Jews will die. Then Haman and the king have a drinking banquet to celebrate their really horrible decision. The focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai, who are the only hope for the Jewish people. They make a plan that Esther is going to reveal her Jewish identity to the king and ask him to reverse the decree. But approaching the king without the royal request, according to Persian law, is an act worthy of death. And she's not been called before the king for 30 days. So in a key statement, Mordecai is confident that even if Esther remains silent, that deliverance for the Jews will arrive from another place. And then Mordecai wonders out loud and he says, who knows? Maybe you've become queen for this very moment. Well, Esther responds with bravery and she purposes to go to the king with her amazing words, if I perish, I perish. What unfolds next is the ironic reversal of all Haman's evil plans. So Esther hosts the king and Haman in a first banquet where she says she wants to make a special request to both of them at an exclusive banquet the following day. Haman leaves the banquet totally drunk and full of pride at the thought of being invited twice to the Queen Esther's house. However, between the two occasions, he sees Mordecai in the street and he fumes with anger and then orders that a 75-foot tall stake be built so that Mordecai can be impaled on it in the morning. It seems like things can't get any worse for the Jews and for Mordecai. But all of a sudden, the story pivots. It just so happens that night, the king can't sleep. And he asks for the royal chronicles to be read to him for some good bedtime reading. And he just happens to hear about how Mordecai had saved the king's life. He had totally forgotten. Very early in the morning, Haman enters the king's presence with the intention of requesting Mordecai's immediate execution. But before Haman could tell him why he was there so early, King Xerxes asked Haman what the king should do for a man he wanted to honor. Well, of course, thinking the king wanted to honor him, Haman thinks up an elaborate parade, which included the honoree riding the king's horse through town while wearing the king's robe and crown, while also being led by one of the king's most noble princes. Imagine Haman's surprise when the king tells Haman that he should make all the arrangements to honor Mordecai in the exact way Haman proposed. Haman's mortified, humiliated, and furious as he leads Mordecai through the streets. But he couldn't stay angry very long because before it was time to return to Queen Esther's house for the banquet. Now, this moment in the story is a pivot for the whole book where it begins Haman's downfall and Mordecai's rise to power. Listen to how this works. The day after is Esther's second banquet. So the king and Haman arrive, and Esther informs the king that, first of all, she's Jewish, And second, that the vile adversary and enemy, Haman, has enacted a decree to murder her and murder Mordecai, who saved his life, and to murder all the Jews. Well, the king has had a lot to drink, so when he hears the news, he yet goes into another drunken rage and orders Haman to be impaled on the very stake made for Mordecai. It's ironic, kind of a grisly way to go. His execution, however, doesn't solve the problem of the decree to kill the Jews. So the focus now turns to Esther and Mordecai as they make a plan to reverse the decree. So instead, the king commissions Mordecai to issue a counter decree on the appointed day that all the Jews were supposed to be killed, the 13th of Adar. Now, the Jews are ordered to defend themselves and destroy any who plotted to kill them. Then Mordecai, Esther, and Jews everywhere all hold banquets and feasts to celebrate this new decree, and Mordecai is elevated to a seat beside the king. Eventually, the decree day comes, and the Jews triumph over their enemies. First, they destroy Haman's family, and then any other Persian officials who join Haman's plot. And then on the second day, they get permission to destroy any who plotted against them throughout the entire kingdom. This results in joy and celebration as the Jews are rescued from annihilation. And then the story tells about how Esther and Mordecai established by decree to create this annual 2-day feast called Purim to commemorate their deliverance from destruction. And the name of the feast comes from Haman's dice. Remember? Purim. The book is concluded with an epilogue as Mordecai is elevated to second in command of the kingdom, and we're told of his royal greatness and splendor as the Jews thrive in exile. Summary of Esther. So when you look at this story, tremendous trouble came into their lives, right? If God doesn't intervene, they're all destroyed. Well, I think there's lots of applications for us in this book. All right, well, if you take out your outline, let's kind of pull some principles out of this book of Esther. And I will warn you up front, I don't know what happened to me. I think I was doing my notes like late at night and I was groggy or something, but there's going to be a few corrections in this outline, okay? So I don't want that to be a distraction, but that's going to happen. All right? Number one, believe God is working even when you don't see him. So I mentioned earlier, if you read the entire 10 chapters in the book of Esther, the name of God is not mentioned one time, which I think is really weird for a book of the Bible, right? But you can clearly see that he's working behind the scenes. He's making things happen. So I think we should take comfort in this, that we should just believe God is working. Believe what you know about him, even though you don't see him at the time, okay? So look at 2 Corinthians 5:7. Real short verse, but it says, "For we live by faith, not by sight." So remember that. Just because you don't see him, you keep holding on to your faith and believe he's a good God and he's going to take care of you. Okay? Number two, go ahead, and this is not real like deep spiritual, but go ahead and cry. God's listening and cares. Now, how many people have you ever heard up in a poll just telling you to cry? Well, it's true. I think it's a good thing, all right? Look at Esther 4, and it's 4:1 and 3. It said, "When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes." Do you blame them? You just heard a decree that you and all of your people and family are going to be killed and destroyed. I think that's worthy of a good cry. You see in Psalms 6, verses 6 through 8, it says, "I'm worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak with sorrow. They fail because of all my foes. Away from me, all you who do evil, for the Lord has heard my weeping." See, it's okay to cry. You just don't need to stay there and wallow in your misery, right? But it's okay to have those emotions. And, I just thought about this too. You remember Jesus when he was about ready to raise Lazarus from the dead? I mean, he even knew what he was about ready to do, right? And he sees everybody crying and all upset. Well, what was his response? Get over it, buck up? No, he cried. Jesus wept, right? That's a pretty good example, I would say. All right, number 3, ask God for direction. In Esther 4:15 through 16a, it says, Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my attendants will fast as you do. So her response was, we're in trouble. We need God, and we need God's people to do all this with me. We need to pray together. We need to fast, and we need God. I mean, he's got to come through for us. I need direction. I can't do this on my own. James 1, verse 5 says, If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. Okay? Ask for God, for God's direction. Okay, number 4. Seek wise counsel and be willing to receive it. Seek wise counsel and be willing to receive it. Esther 2:20, but Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. You see, Esther was actually an orphan. Her mom and dad had died, and her uncle, maybe even cousin, decided to adopt her and bring her up as her own. And she respected his wise counsel. And even as she had grown into an adult, she still relied on his wise counsel. So this is a good example for us. Proverbs 19, verse 20 says, Listen to advice and accept discipline, and at the end you will be counted among the wise. Right? So you don't need to go it alone. Seek out wise counsel. Don't seek out the friends that are going to tell you what you want to hear, by the way. Seek out the friends and counselors that are going to tell you the truth, right? Okay. Verse 5. Trust God to rescue you, even if he doesn't show up when and how you think he should. Esther 4, and this is where you need to kind of correct your outline, 14a, not 16. Okay? Mordecai says to Esther, For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. You kind of see the confidence in his voice there. He's saying, look, even if you don't do what's right, I know God's going to come through and save his people because God's faithful. Okay? So that's what we need to do. We need to trust God's going to rescue even when we don't feel like he's going to. Job 13:15a. This was my grandmother's favorite verse in the whole Bible. And every time I read it, I think of her. It says, though he slay me, yet I will hope in him. See, right to the very end. Even though you die, you're going to trust in him and hope in him all the way to the very end. That's what we need to do. Psalms 91:14 through 15. Because he loves me, says the Lord, I will rescue him. I will protect him, for he acknowledges my name. He will call on me, and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. Isn't that a nice one? That should give you comfort. Several years ago, trouble hit our family. And what had happened was that I had actually landed my dream job. I'd always wanted to be the general manager of a manufacturing company. And God blessed me with that job. But he gave me a tough one. I came into the role and they hadn't been profitable for like 10 years. But God blessed me with a team, and we were able to turn that company around and had double-digit growth for 4 years. And but one day, I looked up from my desk, and the vice president of HR walks through my door. Now, when the vice president of HR walks through your door, they're usually not there for a good reason. And he quickly tells me, he said, hey, look, Tim, sorry, but the management or the owners had decided to go a different direction. I go, what in the world does that mean? But what it meant was that he helped me box my stuff up. And then he came and got my company car. And I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. The whole front office was laid off, and they decided to run the company from corporate. But I want to be a little bit transparent here, and I'm not saying this to brag, But I had 25 years of senior level management experience. I've got an advanced business degree, an MBA, and I'm really good at what I do, all right? And in my mind, there's never going to be a reason why I'm going to be unemployed. Never, right? Wrong. So even though this was a shock to my system, I went home. All I needed to do was make a few phone calls, send out a few resumes, and they're going to be lined up at the door waiting to hire me. 6 months later, I was still looking. And some of my friends know, I still obsess me even all these years later. Some of you know what we went through as a family. Luckily, I'd gone through this Dave Ramsey course with one of our church members here, and I'd actually put away a little bit of money, right? We burned through that crazy quick. We had 3 kids in Christian school. We had chosen that Pam was going to stay home and raise her kids, and so there was no income there. And I went from a really good income to $200 a week on unemployment. And man, I just did everything I could to try to get that interview and whatever, and it just didn't come. Well, we were invited to go up to one of Pam's family's family reunions up at the Indian reservation in White Cloud. My wife's Native American. And we were sitting there eating, and one of her cousins came up to me and asked me if she could talk to me, and I said, sure, And she kind of just quietly said, I heard that you guys are having a tough time. And I said, yeah, but God's going to come through. Well, we had recently heard that she'd received Christ. And so this was really the first time that I'd been able to talk to her since she had received Christ. Well, she told me that God had told her to encourage us. And so she held out her hand and she gave me something. And I could tell that it was some money. And I said, oh no, look, we're going to be okay, We don't need this. Now, her cousin is a single mom, and she's working a part-time job, okay? Well, I stuck that in my pocket, and when we went to go leave, I got in the car, I pulled that out, and it was $500. Now, that's a drop in the bucket on what we needed to do, but I have relived that moment over and over and over again, that God, first of all, wanted to humble me, and second, he was telling me that he could provide for me from any source, from anyone, anytime he wanted. Amen. That he had something for me to learn. And so the very next day, I went outside and I was still just crushed by God. That whole feeling that Dan explained. And it just seemed like God talked to me and he said, okay, are you done? Are you done fighting me? Are you done struggling yourself to try to figure this out? Are you going to let me be God? And I said, yeah. No matter what? Yes. And it was like the next day I get a phone call and boom, job. I said, why couldn't you have done that earlier? Yeah, we know why. I did not expect that one. All right. Number 6, God is sovereign, but you decide if his will is accomplished through you. That's a mind-blower principle there. He's the creator of the universe, sovereign, but he gives you the free will to decide if he's going to work through you. Esther 4:12, and this is where you need to, 14, 12 through 14, Esther 4:12. Okay, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your family's father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Esther had a decision to make. Was she going to let God work his will through her, or was she going to take what she perceived as the safe and comfortable path? I mean, she was the queen of Persia. Why did she have to take the risk? Philippians 2:13, for it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. All right. Point number 7. Do everything you know to do within your ability. Esther This is going to be kind of weird, but hang in there with me. Esther 5, 1 through 2. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Okay, so she had a plan, right? She was doing everything that she knew to do. She was moving forward, taking that next step. And one of the things she really knew how to do was that she was gorgeous. And so she put on her royal robes. Okay, and I can kind of picture this in my mind. The king's like doing his little kingly duties, signing papers or what have you. And he looks up and he sees Esther, kapow! Poised at this long hall, and wow! She just blew his eyeballs right out of his sockets, right? Well, she was using what God gave her to work his will through her life and to influence the king. It's Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. So we've got plans. Doesn't hurt to follow those. But when you trust God to work through you, it's going to be his purpose that prevails. Number 8, be willing to look beyond your own problems and to help others. Esther 4:11, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. You see, Esther, this was a scary thing for her. She was putting her life on the line. But you know what? She saw the trouble that was coming down for everybody else, all her family, all her people. And you know what? She was willing to step out there and risk her own life to save her people. So be willing to look beyond your own problems to help others. Philippians 2, 3 through 4, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interest, but each of you to the interest of the others. Okay. Point number 9. Exercise patience and humility while navigating through times of trouble. Esther 5, 7 through 8. Said, Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. This is her talking to the king. He said, if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. You see, Esther didn't go in there and scream and throw herself down on the ground and yell and demand that she be heard or anything like that. She was smooth. She was patient. She's working the plan. And you see the language she used. She was very humble. Hey, she was still the queen of Persia, right? I mean, Vashti had the guts enough to tell the king no, right? Well, she remained patient and humble as she worked through this. At times when we have trouble, I think the first response sometimes is that we play the victim. And like I said, it's okay to cry, but you can't stay there, right? You can't wallow in that. You can't, oh, woe is me, what am I going to do? You got to step up and start trying some things. Why is this happening to me? You can't stay there. James 5:11, as you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. And then one more verse to just underscore this point. So humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Okay, point number 10. Remain steadfast in your convictions, even if doing so brings personal discomfort and loss. Remain steadfast in your convictions, even if doing so brings personal discomfort and loss. Esther 3:2. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. You see, this, like I said, it went way beyond just giving honor and respect. This was a worship. In fact, some scholars believe that Haman actually had a carved god necklace that, and it would actually be Mordecai bowing down to a carved image. I mean, it was this bad for them. But you know what? It would have been very much easier on everybody if Mordecai had kneeled. But you know what? It was against his convictions. So he held true. All right, now, because this is called a bonus point, because I didn't want to have 11 points, I want to have 10. So I just called it a bonus. I know, again, late night, I'm sorry. Don't forget to celebrate when God comes to your rescue. I tell you what, when I finally got that job, I had like all my friends over. We had a big steak dinner. I was so happy. I just wanted them to share in the blessing that God, did for us. Man. So anyway, Esther 9:17. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. Psalms 40:1-3. I waited patiently for the Lord. He turned to me and heard my cry. He lifted me out of the slimy pit, out of the mud and mire. He set my feet on a rock and gave me a firm place to stand. He put a new song in my mouth, a hymn of praise to our God. Many will see and fear the Lord and put their trust in him. So I hope these points are an encouragement to you. When you face trouble again, I know sometimes it's hard to retain a lot of this, but I hope at least a few of them hang in there with you and they're an encouragement to you. I have one testimony left that I want to share before we go to the invitation. And I'm going to have Jennifer Boyd come on up now. And I have just recently met Jennifer, and I think she's just a wonderful woman of God. She has a story that I think will touch you and is really applicable to what we're talking about today. There you go. You're fine.
Good morning. Good morning. As I'm hearing Tim preach, I was thinking, I am my own Haman, for sure.
Good, put this up. Yeah, so they can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Okay. Thriving through adversity, as I was trying to think of what moment in my life or event in my life that would match this title, the word that mostly came to my mind to answer that question was surviving instead of thriving. And we don't want to just survive through our trials and tribulations that come our way. We do want to thrive. So I have many different stories and events, some of them really major that was more surviving as opposed to thriving. There's one in particular, though, that the Lord has laid heavier on my heart this morning that went from striving to thriving. And that's the one I want to share with you. And just to give a little background, I was, as many of you may have already been as well, raised in a dysfunctional family and household. I don't know very many families that aren't dysfunctional to some degree. Mine was full of alcohol and addictions and abuse, and so then later in life I became the abused that was the abuser. So that's kind of how that happened. All to say, several years ago, my husband and I, we were pretty hurt by the church. I was actually already a manager at Elios. When they first opened it 2011, I came on staff there. And about a year and a half later, we started, in my opinion, getting devoured by the enemy. So with that background of abused and being angry and the abuser, there's a lot of just dysfunctional and just your thinking, your habits, and just the way that you view the world, really. Even though you have your worldview of what you know of God to be true, you're still tainted when some things aren't completely healed. And so when you get injured, we got injured by the church, and we had a year of just being devoured and our sin exposed, and we ended up in divorce, actually. I left Elios, we left the church, and then eventually I left our marriage. We have done everything to destroy our marriage, infidelity, all kinds of abuse, just whatever you might list, we probably have touched on it. I've even tried running the poor man over before. So it has gotten pretty ugly. We, by providence of God, started back in each other's lives about maybe A year after we separated, only a couple months after we actually divorced. And during that time, we had a falling out on the side of the road in California. And embarrassingly to admit that I ended up in prison that night with an orange jumpsuit, facing a felony because I am the angry abuser. And I don't even know what to say. When I got there, though, let me back up just a minute. We had a nonprofit for that year and a half. I was at Elias, and our clientele would come through Elias. We partnered with City Union Mission. I worked a lot with women to get them off the streets and teach them God's truth and that they are worth loving. And our favorite psalm for Heard My Cry Ministries is Psalm 40, verse 1. When I got into that prison, the bunk that they sent me to had a sheet of paper on it, and on that sheet of paper was Psalm 40. Verses
Coincidence.
1 through 5. I was like, okay, so the Lord has placed me right here in this bunk, in this prison. And at this time, I didn't know I was facing actual prison time. I was thinking, well, I'm in a different state. I know nobody. Surely this isn't really happening. But by day 3, not knowing even when a court date might be, some reality started setting in, and I started pleading to the Lord, obviously. And I just started going through scripture and scripture by scripture, and he emphasized Hebrews chapter 12 in me. I had not yet resisted sin to the point of death, and that he did love me, and that he was disciplining me. And he disciplines those he loves, his children. And so I repented completely day 3 in a prison in California, and forgave my husband for everything, and people from my past, my traumatic childhood. Just clean slate, completely surrendered myself. Okay, so I was now at the point where I will give my life to this prison if this is where you have me, because I know I deserve to be here. And what I don't deserve is your love and your forgiveness that he was giving me anyway. 2 days later, day 5 in prison, they cuffed me up and transported me over an hour down the road in these little cages that they have you sitting in this bus to go before a judge. And they put me, when we got there, they unshackled me, and I was put in a cell, and not even an hour later, couldn't have been, they came back, brought me out of the cell, and said, your record is expunged. I didn't even have to go before the judge. Like, it was completely dropped, which is really great news, except at 9 o'clock that night, I'm being released from this potential prison life, homeless in California, where I know no one, at nighttime with, I think I may have had $30-something in my checking account. So let me wrap this up a little bit. Long story short, I called my divorcee, their spouse, and I said, I really need you to forgive me. I'm begging you to forgive me. Please forgive me for everything that I have done. We have to get remarried. We have to obey Christ first. And many things happened. The Lord actually brought me back from California with a dog, with no money, and no help from outside sources. So that's a really fun story at some time. But we had to call Dan Smith. I told my husband, I said, you're going to have to call Dan Smith, because God said we have to go back to Kansas City, and we have to go back to Elias, and we have to get remarried, and we have to forgive each other for everything. And so Dan Smith remarried us December of 2015. And none of that is even including the spiritual warfare that is also happens in our daily lives, being in the front lines down there in the urban core. So we covet all prayers. But yeah, so long story short, thriving now is the Lord calls us to pray. Pray, pray, pray. That's the difference between surviving and thriving. submitting your whole life, my whole everything to God and His will, regardless of how uncomfortable that might be. Like in Luke chapter 4, I was going through this morning, when Satan took Jesus up into the mountains. If he was not in one communion with the Lord, then there wouldn't have been such calmness in remembering who his identity is and who God the Father is. And that's what we are called to do every minute of our day. And that's the only way we can thrive through whatever adversity comes our way, is to completely submit your whole life and minute, even and down to, Lord, what do you want me to say in this conversation to this person? So, there we go.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you. All right, so let's quick review, and then we'll have the invitation. So if Annie'd like to come on up, that would be great. So, first point, believe God is working even when you don't see Him. Number 2, go ahead and cry. God is listening and cares. Number 3, ask God for direction. Number 4, seek wise counsel and be willing to receive it. Number 5, trust God to rescue you even if He doesn't show up when and how you think He should. Number 6, God is sovereign, but you decide if His will is accomplished through you. Number 7, do everything you know to do within your ability. Number 8, be willing to look beyond your own problems to help others. Number 9, exercise patience and humility while navigating through times of trouble. Number 10, remain steadfast in your convictions, even if doing so brings personal discomfort and loss. And remember the bonus, don't forget to celebrate when God comes through for you.